We've all experienced situations that trouble us, times when people, quote, push our buttons. We've seen that in other people, wondering not why they get so frustrated so easily. Sometimes those are just simple frustrations, but other times the issues go deeper than that. Sometimes early traumas have caused us to have post-traumatic stress disorder, or caused us to have stress later on related to earlier stressors. And that's our topic for today. We're talking about the invisible epidemic of PTSD. Welcome.
You know, we're talking about PTSD, and one of the things that happens to me quite often, not necessarily every week, but I thought about it this past week, was the flashbacks I get from an incident with our son. He was 11 months old, and he fell out the back of our truck. Yeah.
Well, he fell out the back of your truck when?
Yes.
When he was how old?
11 months old. We had gone to one of the nursing homes not far from here. And we'd visited and sung with our, youth group, and all I kept hearing in my ear was, make sure you wash your hands, make sure you wash your hands, make sure you wash your hands. So took him to the back of the car, put him inside, and he usually plays this game with my husband where he'd be in the back of the truck and play peekaboo with him, and I was looking for the hand wipes. And so he was playing peekaboo with me, and I was opening the back of the truck, but there's this part where you can't see. But he was only 11 months old, so he was leaning against the door as I was lifting it, and right when I couldn't see him anymore, I lifted it all the way up, and he came toppling off. And let me tell you something. I see him falling out of that truck so often. I mean, sometimes I'm just going along, doing something, and I'll just jump because I'm thinking about him falling out. And I think I was more traumatized about him falling out than he was. I mean, he cried more for the x-rays at the urgent care than when he fell out the truck. Even this morning I looked at his picture and he has the scar on his head for his 1-year-old picture because it was a month later. So yeah, it's
very
something.
traumatizing.
It is very traumatizing.
I saw on the news this week a woman whose son had been killed, and it was particularly grisly, something in the news. And what she said was, every time I shut my eyes, I see this happening, and I remember where I was, and I remember, it feels like it's happening now. So she was having difficulty telling the difference between what was happening now and what was happening when the trauma occurred. And that really stood out for me, because I think there is some real difficulty with people who are traumatized to tell what was then and what is now.
Absolutely.
And that's what I was going to share. Is I was talking with someone this last week, and they got overly defensive. And I remember looking at them and I said, "Are you okay?" And they knew instantly what had happened. They stopped and they said, it really isn't what you just said. It's something that I hear ringing in my ears for years and years since I was a little girl. And my father yelled at me all the time. And I can tell myself, even as I'm standing here, it's not what she just said. But she said, I can't control that same response pattern. Yeah, she said, I can feel myself doing it, and it just comes anyway.
And I want to stay there a little bit. We don't often realize that our past really follows us. And there are things that we react to based on things that happened in our past, and we go, she's so testy, or or he's so he doesn't hear you when you're listening, or he flies into a rage, not realizing that it may have been something that has happened in the past that so traumatized them. And I don't even think that they can articulate. Not many people can actually articulate and say, the reason I'm responding this way now is because it just took me all the way back,
or brought the past all the way into the present, and they are re-experiencing that trauma right there, right now, and can't control it.
And that made me think of something. I remember once, my husband and I were talking about something, and we were having a disagreement, and he said something, and I said to him, "You just spoke to me like my father spoke to me." And I'm not happy about that. And that was the first time in my life that I'd even
Made the connection.
made a connection, but it was it was so sudden. And he looked at me and he was like, "I'm sorry. This is because I wasn't trying to be your dad." It was just a statement that he made. And again, we just don't realize how our childhood, some of the experiences that we had were actually traumatizing because we just thought it was a way of life.
Well, and then it leads us to maybe to talk for a minute about the difference between stress that comes from things that happened earlier and post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think one of the differences, a disorder is where there are patterns established as a way of responding to a stress, that those patterns are still continuing to operate your life.
Right.
Even though the trauma isn't
Even
anywhere.
though the trauma isn't currently going
yeah.
on.
Wow, good point. Well, here's a case situation for us to think about to start our conversation today. Our friend's house was recently destroyed by a tornado, and isn't that a shame? We've had so many homes lost recently because of these tornadoes. They lost everything, however, and barely escaped with their lives. They've come to live with us for a while with their 8-year-old daughter and 10-year-old son. That's a really impressionable age for this to happen, isn't it? Their children are having a hard time coping with the loss of their home and with the displacement. We live in another state, yet every night their daughter wakes up screaming that she doesn't want to die, bless her heart. She believes that any moment a tornado will destroy our house.
Wow. Wow.
Now, the first part of this, before we got to the fact that she was screaming, wouldn't necessarily be post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Because just because an event like a tornado has come doesn't mean the people are going to have PTSD.
Not necessarily. I think, well, there is something called acute stress disorder, and that's what happens for the first month. It's a pretty normal response to something horrific that, is potentially life-threatening, and maybe she had that, but it doesn't all develop into PTSD. You're right.
So for moving to another state has also caused some displacement for her. She's not there anymore to see what was going on. I think the parents may have felt it may have been good to have a fresh start. I mean, we don't know what made them leave the house, but here she's getting up at night screaming.
Well, and that's what alerts us to it being PTSD, is that she didn't just wake up once screaming, she
Every
wakes up
night.
screaming. So this sounds like a habit pattern that's coming from this child here. I guess what I'm trying to point out is that not every stressful situation, even a traumatic
Stressful
situation,
situation.
causes PTSD.
Okay. That's good clarification.
Say more about that.
Well, just because it's something is traumatic, what would be considered traumatic, like the loss of a parent, say, it doesn't mean the child will develop PTSD symptoms.
And what determines whether or not they would go that direction?
Well, one thing is by whether or not they have someone to talk about it with. So it's not the trauma itself that causes a problem. It's the resources that people have in being able to deal with that trauma. It's really interesting because we used to think that every time there was a difficult situation, we ought to sit around and talk about it.
Right.
And we were quite surprised when the research suggested that sometimes sitting around and talking about it actually caused trauma to the people who had not experienced that situation as traumatic.
Wow.
Because
So-
it made it so alive for them. It was like they experienced it themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so some of the risk factors for PTSD are living through dangerous events and traumas, but also having a history of mental illness could be a risk factor that would contribute to that, and also seeing people get hurt.
Now let's just go back to that. What do you think? Why would having a mental illness sort of set one up for PTSD? Do you think?
I'm not really sure.
I don't know.
I don't know either. I'm thinking though it would. I think if you don't have the coping resources,
Maybe
You're
coping
more
or-
fragile.
Or maybe, I'm guessing here, but I'm wondering also maybe there might not be as strong a tie to reality and being able to distinguish the difference between what happened then or what happens now And also maybe not being able to stop those thoughts from making a person escalate.
And maybe if those individuals were mentally ill are on medication, some medications do cause have side effects that could also create more problems for them along the, I always notice nowadays when even some of the sleeping stuff, it will say, the fine print will say side effects will be, sleeplessness, suicidal thoughts,
Panic,
the panic, on and on.
Are you saying that those types of medications can increase the potential for PTSD?
I'm saying someone who's mentally ill that might be on medication, depending on what the medication is and
Right.
what the effects are, going through traumatic experiences or having an experience that might be stressful at the time
Right.
could also may possibly increase the risk of them developing PTSD.
One thing I was going to add there, as you're talking about risk, I think when children have severe trauma, and even before the pre-verbal, when they're not talking yet, it can be so overpowering and overwhelming. It sets up a way of relating to the world that can be a continuous chronic PTSD type of behavior. I was burned really badly when I was 17 months old, and I have no recollection of being burned, or almost no recollections of being in the hospital, certainly. But I do have a few, the little flash kind of memories we have at our earliest types of.
Isn't that the story, that the singing where you were singing?
Yeah, I was singing in the hospital when I was burned. And what I know is that even into my adult years, when I'd sit down at my computer, I had this irrational thought that water was going to come gushing out of the computer at me. As I was sitting there facing this, the light would come on. I never ducked, but I remember thinking, now that is a wild association, that I would even think such a thing. Didn't have nightmares, but I had these kind of weird connections. And I did go into some treatment for post-traumatic symptoms. It didn't bother me. I didn't have nightmares or anything, but I think because it happened when I was pre-verbal, largely, it had a huge impact. And I would guess that other children who have these kind of medical traumas would certainly be badly affected, have the potential, maybe not all, but they have the potential.
I was looking at some research on women who'd been sexually abused, and it was interesting to me that in this research, there was no relation between the type of abuse they experienced and whether or not they had PTSD symptoms. But what did relate is whether or not they had someone to talk about it with. So those who had even a lower level trauma, if they had no one that believed them and listened to them, they would develop post-traumatic stress symptoms.
So there was a way for them to get the immediate comfort and coping that they needed.
Yeah, apparently it's a huge resource to have someone that believes you when you've had personal trauma.
And to tag on to that, about 60% of women who are in domestic violent type of relationships have PTSD. So we know it's very, very traumatizing, or can be, to be thrown around or threatened or to feel unsafe. So 60%, that's a lot of women.
Well, think of it, feeling unsafe. We always hear about post-traumatic stress disorder in the lives of the vets, the war vets. And I have here, it says between the years of 2002 and 2008, the VA had some 178,000 vets who were diagnosed with possible mental disorders. 92,000 of those were diagnosed with PTSD, and 63,000 had depressive disorders. So we see it a lot in war vets. I think the thing we don't think about it is in daily life. But think about it's actually similar, isn't it? Is that you feel unsafe when you're out in war, and children or abusive situations, people feel unsafe within the confines of their own home.
Well, some of the criteria for PTSD would be that you had exposure to a potentially life-threatening concern, like abuse or threat or assault, and that the response that you had was one of horror, if not immediately, then soon thereafter, and that eventually this interferes with sleeping, with thinking. Adults get flashbacks, children would have nightmares, or children would do things like have this grim repetitive play, and they'd play it over and over and over again. And it's been said that they keep playing it over to put a different end on the story to make them come out safe at the end.
So are
And
you
I
saying
think it's
that,
fascinating.
Yes, so you're saying that if a child has experienced some sort of trauma, they will use it in their play, like with their dolls or their puppets or whatever.
Yes, I once did offered therapy to a child who was very traumatized by being in a violent home, and we played together in this little kitchen area, and no less than 10 times over 2 sessions, he tried to push me in the oven. And he was doing something that he
Wait.
had seen happen.
Push
There
you
was a
into a
little
play
there was a
oven?
little play oven, a little play school kitchen set. And as we were playing in there, 10 times he was trying to get me to get my head in the oven and push me in the oven. And he had seen some behaviors like this. So he was trying to, and each time we'd come to it, I said, well, now what should we do so that we're both safe? But he would still keep doing it almost as if to see if it was really going to be safe when we finished.
That's interesting. I had a child that kept wanting me to hit the doll.
Oh.
She had a little doll,
Right.
and she said, "Now you hit the doll." And I said, "Why?" Because the doll was bad,
Oh.
and she thought the doll ought to be hit. And she kept playing that over and over. And I said, "Well, how about let's not hit the doll? But then how will the doll learn anything if you don't hit her really hard?" I mean, that was the connection she was
Wow.
making.
Well, that's really touching.
It is very touching, yeah.
So how would we, I'm looking at this for this child who's, living through a tornado. I mean, having gone through that experience, I'm taking it that the child may have been in the house when the tornado hit. So she's screaming every night that she doesn't want to die. She's definitely associating destruction and death with that trauma of that tornado. And I think it would be, as we've talked about so far, be good for the family to sit and just kind of talk to her about what happened, and maybe even see a counselor or just read go to
What
the
is the
library, get
horror
some
here?
books.
Barbara, you talked about horror. There's a tornado. When we had them when I was growing up, it wasn't so horrible because it was like exciting to get in the cellar and all that. So what is the horror here that I didn't necessarily experience, would you say?
Well, we don't know if she lost her pets. We don't know if she had pets. We don't know if she witnessed the house going straight up, or if she
was in
saw
the
the
house.
just carnage in the
Left after the
neighborhood.
house.
But to lose everything that anchors you to who you are as a child, I think that is very frightening. And probably the roar of the wind and not being sure what was happening. And if you look up and you see your parents' faces, to be horrified faces and terrified, I think it would have a huge impact.
See, I think that's the horror. As long as your parents are happy, and I remember my dad saying, "Oh, okay, let's head to the cellar." It was almost like an event. Whereas I'm wondering, they barely escaped with their lives.
Well,
So you can imagine a child seeing that fear of death on her parents' faces. That's horror.
I think anything at all that you could do to diminish the anxiety in the family as it is, to have things like evening prayers and to talk about, let's thank God for all the days we never had to worry about tornadoes, and let's think about making a plan for if there is one, and how will we know, and will we hear a siren, and there are ways to know so we can be prepared. So anything to reduce just general anxiety for a child, I think, is helpful.
But we recently talked about those things that aren't related to weather. They're just related to a consistent terror in the home. And what children consider terror is a lot different than what adults consider terror.
I think, Dilys, what you said is, why are you laughing here? I'm thinking, let me just bring that back to me. She's doing a choke a little bit here. I'm just thinking, for
I was just wondering what she was thinking. Her thoughts were.
for little kids who they live in an abusive home. I think they still have to talk about the times that they're not hurt. And I think they have to continually talk about what are the things we do if we're in these scary situations, because kids pick up on the anxiety and the unpredictability of a situation so fast.
Absolutely. I think when Carla was asking us to kind of identify what exactly was the horror in the story, I'm thinking about being intentional as a parent of 2 really young children about not creating fear,
Yes.
you know, for them, and to really not to downplay the seriousness of things, but to just not create fearful children. You know, every night we pray. You know, the other night we prayed, and my son said, "Mommy, you didn't pray that I would have I'd have a safe night." And I said, "Okay," you know, and so I stopped and I did that prayer for him. And we've talked about it, you know, Micah, are monsters real? You know, the kind that no. So are there monsters in our house? No. Who's with us? You know, God is with us. He looks over us. And, you know, his closet door is open and we go through that whole process. And yet he's like, I need you to pray. He even borrowed a book from the library the other day about monsters. And he thought it was hilarious about monsters wearing pants and monsters juggling things and what they eat. And he read it and it was funny to him.
I think I know the book.
I do
love
too.
that book
Yeah.
because it actually
Demystifies, yes,
it
yes.
makes monsters almost funny.
Funny, right.
Yes.
There are some wonderful children's books on
What
these
goes
issues
bump in
too.
the night,
Yes,
something like that. Yeah.
But it's
Sorry,
even
Mom.
with that, you know, I still go, even though cognitively I know we're putting those foundations in so he knows you don't have to be afraid, at the same time he's still going, Mommy, you forgot to pray, you know, and so it's really important, I think, for parents and for the adults around children to really not allow their own fear to infect the children, because you're right, if they see the grown-ups being afraid,
Yes. Oh, that's terrifying.
then what can they possibly do?
Or to see something that you don't understand. I remember having some pet chicks and coming home one day and the dog had just ravaged the chicks. And there were little feathers everywhere, little chick bodies. And I remember just being horrified that in the animal kingdom, a dog, my pet dog, or who knows what dog it was, could do something so horrible. You just don't know what a person finds horrifying until you get inside their skin.
I think for adults, sometimes it's a little bit different, and I think adults can do some strange things thinking that they're back in that situation, or maybe not even thinking they're in that situation, but like you started off by saying, it pushed all my buttons, and so I kind of went to the default place where I went during the trauma. And it's sometimes just talking about it and saying, yep, that's what I'm struggling with, and maybe I'll get some extra help on that and make a big difference.
Well, let's look at some email questions. My brother just returned from being in combat. He thinks he has PTSD. Is it only soldiers that struggle with PTSD? Sometimes I think families struggle too.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, we've talked about that.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And the family is definitely affected by what that individual has gone through, even though they haven't been there. And I don't know that the veterans always know how to articulate or even want to share
Or they
with their
don't know they
loved
have
ones
it. Yeah.
what it was that they have gone through. And I think, you know, the horror of war, you know, it's not something we talk about, you know, like what do you do when you're faced with that? I have a friend who works for the police department. I have several friends who work for police departments, and sometimes when I see something on television that's really horrific, I go, oh my gosh, I need to pray for them more, because this is not TV. It's not roll camera cut. They're walking out there, they're seeing it every day. You know, how do you not get calloused? How do you not relive that over and over and over again? So I don't think veterans, police officers, firemen, I don't know that they always know how to articulate that. So the family feels we're not invited into that part of your world. So I definitely think that this individual, I would say yes, the families absolutely struggle with that person's PTSD.
Well, the next question is here, does PTSD ever go away?
For some people, it doesn't for a very long time. I mean, don't you think? Especially if they don't get treatment, it doesn't just go away on its own.
No, time does not
Time
heal
doesn't
this.
heal
It
this.
can make it worse sometimes.
Especially if they're not in as we talked about, in a
Supportive.
supportive community where they can share what's going on with them and get some support on that. Sometimes it seems that people use the phrase PTSD as an excuse for everything. How can you tell if someone really has it? You know, we call our show the invisible epidemic. So epidemic seems something that's spreading.
Do you think people go around flashing the fact that they have PTSD? I mean, have you seen that? I've never seen that.
No.
Because usually it strikes me that people with PTSD are really hesitant to say anything about it because there's some shame around that, and you don't want to relive everything. So,
Yeah. No, I agree. I think it's the opposite. It's not that it's a catch-all phrase. It's a phrase that's not understood as well as it ought to be. And more people probably have it than are
There are
aware.
others, yeah.
I'm tired of having my buttons pushed all the time in situations that I can't control. I'll be going along fine, and then suddenly I'm right there in the trauma that I'm trying to forget. The people in my current life should not have to deal with my past. I feel guilty a lot of the time. Wow. Now there's a person who understands PTSD.
Who's trying to be accountable.
Is trying to be accountable. This phrase, my buttons pushed all the time in situations that I can't control. I'll be going along fine, and suddenly I'm right there in the trauma.
Speaking of buttons being pushed, it always amazed me that our Veterans Hospital, with a large psychiatric unit with a number of patients with PTSD, is right under the helicopter path to the hospital.
Oh, that's
Now,
true.
that would be something you couldn't control if you have combat-related stress and there's
right.
helicopters going over day and night.
Right.
That would be really, really challenging. I suppose there's some, and I know there's some really good work that can be done around that therapeutically.
Can PTSD be treated with medicine or with natural treatments?
Well, there are certainly medicines that can help. But I think what's generally discussed with PTSD is therapy, and
Yes.
getting help with therapy and understanding how it links to trauma. This other one made me kind of smile. Is it true that PTSD makes your brain smaller?
Oh,
Well,
my.
there is some research that suggests that people who have PTSD actually have smaller portions of their brain. And they don't know whether that smaller portion predisposes them to PTSD or whether the stress actually causes it.
So in other words, a little section or a little piece
A
of their
little
brain will
part
be
of the
smaller
brain
than typical.
in the inner,
Cingulate or something, yeah.
in the center area of the brain, the more emotional area.
Oh, wow.
Does all trauma cause PTSD? I don't think we read that one. If not, what makes one trauma cause it and one not? Does a certain kind of trauma cause PTSD more than others?
That's a loaded question.
Yeah.
I think there's potential to cause trauma in all kinds of difficulties.
Hey, we've been talking about the invisible epidemic, post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD. And there are some factors that would help prevent PTSD really taking over your life. Seeking out support from other people, such as friends and family, finding support groups, feeling good about yourself, having coping strategies, and being able to act and respond effectively despite feeling fear. Thank you so much for joining us today on This Life. And if you know someone who's affected by PTSD, share these things with them.